Okay, I think we start. Good morning. So I wrote a summary of where we arrived last week. So we were considering a finite box, square box, Bn of radius n, which I call lambda, which contains a smaller box Bl, again centered at the origin of radius L, which contains the support of some local function f. And then what we wanted to do was to compare the expected value of this local function f in the box lambda with some boundary condition eta with the corresponding expectation if before computing the value of f I first rotate all the spins in the configuration by an angle psi. Okay? And what we saw last week is that we could bound from above this difference by this quantity, which is the square root of twice the relative entropy between the Gibbs measure mu lambda eta and what I call the psi-deformed Gibbs measure, which was a measure where the Hamiltonian was modified by an application of a rotation, inhomogeneous rotation to all the spins in the lattice. So the relative entropy, which appears in this expression, we computed it last week. It's just given by the expectation under the Gibbs measure in the box lambda with boundary condition eta of the difference between the energy of the configuration after I applied this inhomogeneous rotation and before applied inhomogeneous rotation. So what is the average effect on the energy of applying this inhomogeneous rotation? So more precisely, this inhomogeneous rotation was defined as a function t psi acting on configurations that to a given configuration omega, its effect on the given configuration omega is to rotate the angle at the vertex I by an angle psi I, where psi I is some profile of angles with some value, some angular value at each vertex of the lattice, with the only constraint that outside the box lambda I want the rotation to be equal to 0, and inside the small box Bl I want the rotation to be given by minus psi, so the opposite of this rotation that we are applying here. And just to remind you also, the Hamiltonian of the model we are considering is of the form beta times the sum over all pairs of neighbors intersecting the box lambda of some function v of the difference of angles. And this function v, the only assumption we make is that it's C2. Okay. So we were at this stage last week, and now I want to go on. So if I want to show that this difference goes to 0, I have to show that this relative entropy goes to 0, provided I choose in a wise way the profile psi here. Okay. Sorry?
Norm of f in this inequality.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. Norm of f here. Okay, so what I want to do now is to show that this relative entropy is vanishing when I choose psi in a convenient way. Okay. So I have to study this expectation here. So let's study this expectation. So we have expectation of h lambda composed with t psi compared with expectation of h lambda eta. Now h is here, so we can just write things explicitly. It's the sum over pairs of neighbors in intersecting lambda. Then we have the expectation. So here we will have cosine of, say, theta j minus theta I plus psi j minus psi I, because I've rotated the spin at j by an angle psi j, the spin at I by an angle psi I, so the difference of angle becomes this. And then here in the original, for the original Hamiltonian, I just have minus cosine of theta j minus theta I, and this is computed under the Gibbs measure. Okay. And now we are going to proceed in a way which is completely similar to what we did in this heuristic argument I presented last week, namely, we are going to Taylor expand this cosine here. We are not going to Taylor expand it around 0, as we did in the heuristic argument, because what I want to cancel now is this term. So we are going to expand it around theta j minus theta I. So this guy here is just cosine of theta j minus, oh, sorry, why cosine? It's v. I mean, it could be cosine, but I want a general statement at the moment. So some v, okay, this v, which is here. Cosine would be the case of the xy model, but I just want a general situation. So it's v of theta j minus theta I plus v prime of theta j minus theta I, psi j minus psi I. It's the linear part. And then you have a second order part, which will be plus 1/2 v second, evaluated at some point alpha ij, which we don't care about, times psi j minus psi I square. Okay, I don't have much room. I will write it properly afterward, something like that. So let me write it here because you probably cannot read anything. So it's the sum over all ij's in E lambda b. And then, so this v cancel with this v. So what remains is the expected value of v prime theta j minus theta I lambda eta times psi j minus psi I. That's for the first order term. Plus 1/2 expected value of v second of theta j. No, it was this alpha ij. Lambda eta. We'll get rid of this very quickly. Psi j minus psi I square. And there is a parenthesis here. Okay, so that's what we are left with. And now the observation is the same as we did in the heuristic argument. The assumption is that V is C2, it's a function defined in the circle is a compact set, so the second derivative is bounded. So this guy is smaller than a constant C by the assumption that it's C2. So the whole expectation here is smaller than C. So what you get in the end is a sum of two terms. One is this guy, which is just v prime theta j minus theta I lambda eta psi j minus psi I. And then the second term, which is plus, there is some beta that I forgot everywhere. It won't play any role, but just to say correct things. So I get beta c over 2. And then sum over ij's E lambda b psi j minus psi I square. Okay? So that's what we get as an upper bound. Now if you remember what happened in the heuristic argument, the first order term was vanishing because it was evaluated at 0, and by the fact that v was w of cosine and that the derivative of cosine is sine, that sine at 0 is 0, it was just 0. So we had no first order term. But if the first order term is here, it's very bad for us. Because if you go back to the heuristic argument we made and assume that the first order term is non-zero, the constant is non-zero, then you can check that the rest of the argument just fails completely. So the first order term is very bad. This guy is terrible. With this guy here, we cannot conclude what we want. So we have to find a way of getting rid of it. We cannot get rid of it by symmetry here, it will not work. But we have to find some other way. And the very nice trick is the following. It's relying on a very simple observation. The observation is that by Jensen's inequality, the relative entropy between any two measures is always non-negative. That's always true for any mu. So if we apply this to our particular case, we can bound this relative entropy that we are trying to understand in the following way. So in our case, this implies that the relative entropy between the original Gibbs measure and the deformed Gibbs measure, this I can certainly write that it's smaller than, well, itself. Okay. Plus something positive, which will be the relative entropy between the original Gibbs measure and another deformed Gibbs measure where the deformation is minus psi. That I can do because the term I've added is non-negative because of that. That's greater or equal 0. So this is certainly smaller than that. Okay. So why is it good? Now, what we did for this guy, the bound we derived here for this guy, we can derive exactly the same for this guy. The only thing that changes is that everywhere where you had a psi, now we have a minus psi. Okay. So now let's look at what we got. So the first order term, the psi's will change sign. So when I will add both terms, the first order term will just cancel. But the second order term, it's quadratic, so it will remain. Okay, so what you get is twice the second order term. So this will be smaller, but by what we just did, than beta c. The over 2 disappears because I get it twice. Sum over all ij's in E lambda b, psi j minus psi I square. So we get this bound, which is exactly the same bound that we got in the heuristic argument. So if we wanted, we could stop here, take the same psi that we used in the heuristic argument and conclude the proof. It's not very satisfactory because I have not explained to you where this psi came from, and it's not clear whether it's optimal or not. And moreover, the effect of the dimension, why it works in dimension 1 and 2 and fails dimension 3 and higher, was not clear from the argument. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to choose the best possible psi here. So we will understand what is the effect of the dimension and what is the optimal choice that you can make. Okay. So for that, I just want to introduce a notation before. So this quantity, or essentially this quantity, it has a name. So epsilon of psi, which is defined as 1/2 sum over all ij in E lambda. Okay, let me do it like that, minus BL. See, psi is constant inside BL, so the difference here is always equal to 0 if I take an edge which is inside the small box BL. So I can just as well remove it, does not change anything. And then I have this grad psi ij square, which is exactly the term which is here. So up to the constant, I have replaced the beta c by 1/2. It's exactly the same quantity. This is called the Dirichlet energy of psi inside this set lambda minus BL. So that's the Dirichlet energy of psi. So what we want, so goal, find psi such that psi I is equal to 0 if I is not in lambda, minus small psi if I is in BL, minimizing the Dirichlet energy. That's what we want to do, right? Because we want this bound to be as small as possible, so we want to minimize. So let me state a lemma, which gives you the result. And then we'll prove it, but I would just want to conclude the proof assuming the lemma first. So the lemma is the following. Thank you. So it's lemma 9.8. So this Dirichlet energy is functional, possesses a unique minimizer, among all functions which satisfy, okay, let me write it. So among all functions u from ZD to R such that ui is equal to 0 for all I not in lambda, and ui is equal, I will normalize it to 1. We'll see that it doesn't change anything. I mean, if I multiply psi by a constant, this just multiply the Dirichlet energy by the square of the constant, so we'll see later that it plays no role. So let me put 1, it gives nicer formula. So ui is equal to 1 for all I in BL. Okay. So that's the assumption. So among these functions, there is a unique minimizer. It's completely explicit. So given by, the minimizer is given by a function which is ui star, which is the probability starting at I that the symmetric simple random walk on ZD enters the box BL. So it starts at I and it enters BL before leaving lambda. Before leaving lambda. So that's the probability. So as I said, this is the simple random walk, symmetric simple random walk on ZD. Okay. And moreover, we can compute explicitly the energy associated to the Dirichlet energy associated to this minimizer. So and E of U star, so the energy associated to this profile, is given by D. D is just the dimension of the lattice, the D of ZD, right, times the sum over all vertices J in the interior boundary of BL of the probability starting at J that the random walk exits lambda before visiting BL. So before or returning to BL. Because it's starting there. Returning to BL. Okay, so that's the lemma. So we are going to prove that. It's not difficult. But I want first to use this result to see what is the conclusion for our problem. Okay. How we can conclude this Mermin-Wagner theorem using this lemma. So it's there. Okay, so assume this. Now we are going to choose psi. So I had not chosen psi up to now. So we said psi will just be minus small psi U star. Okay, so that gives me exactly what I want. So inside BL, my psi will be equal to minus small psi because minus small psi times 1. Okay, so I get this. Okay. And with this choice, I see that what I was looking for, so the difference between the expectation of f in lambda and the expectation of f rotated by small psi in lambda, this is smaller than, okay, let me put it immediately so that I don't forget it, L2 now, square root, there was a 2, then there was this beta c, we have it here, so there is this beta c that appears. There is another 2 coming from the fact that I've put 1/2 here, so probably there is a 4 here, whatever. And then I get a psi square because I want this guy. All these are just constant, we don't care really about them. And then we get epsilon of U star. Okay. I had epsilon of psi. This is essentially epsilon of psi. And I want the energy of U star because they are proportional, right? So this tells you that E of psi is psi square E of U star. Okay. So I'm just using that. So if I want to conclude that this difference goes to 0 as lambda goes to ZD in dimension 1 and 2, what I have to show is that this energy associated to U star is going to 0. Okay. So let's do it. We have an explicit expression there. So it's a constant time a finite sum time a probability. So if it has to go to 0, this probability has to go to 0. So let me just look at the probability. So my claim is that this goes to 0 as lambda increases to ZD when D equal 1 or 2. That's what I want to show. So and does not go to 0 in the other cases. So the probability which is there is probability starting at j that the random walk exits lambda before returning to BL. Okay. So this I will bound a bit of a rough way in order to make a very natural quantity appear. That will make this statement obvious. Okay, so let me do a picture, and then I will return to that. So this is lambda, which is just Bn. Okay, then I have my small Bl here. Then I have J, which is, if you look at there, it's in the inner boundary of Bl. So it's a vertex somewhere here. Maybe it's this one. That's J. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to center at J a box of radius n minus L. So it will be a box, something like that. Okay. The picture will be bad, but hopefully it's clear enough. So this is the box J plus B n minus n. Okay. In particular, it's a subset of the original box Bn. And if my random walk has to exit, let me maybe use this. If my random walk, so I'm interested in the event that it exits lambda before returning to BL, so it's doing things like that. And at some point it exits lambda, so maybe let me do it here. So now it has exited lambda before returning to BL. Certainly it has to exit the blue box before. Okay. It cannot exit the big box without exiting the small one. So this will be smaller than the probability starting from J that X exits J plus B n minus L, so this blue box, before. And I can make this even larger if I do not insist that it returns to BL, but I insist on the stronger claim that it returns to J, returning to J. It's much harder to return to J, so it's much more likely that it will manage to exit, returning to J. Okay. Now if I do that in this way, then by translation invariance of the simple random walk, this is just the probability starting from 0 that X exits the box Bn minus L before returning to 0. Okay? But now we know how this behaves. I mean, at least qualitatively. So this is, so as n goes to infinity, this is converging to 0. So n is going to infinity. This is converging to 0 when d equal 1 or 2, because the random walk is recurrent. So the probability that it goes infinitely far away without visiting 0 is going to 0. It's visiting every point infinitely often, recurrent random walk. Okay? So this is going to 0, while it's larger than 0 uniformly in n when d is greater or equal to 3. Okay? Because the random walk is transient, it has a strictly positive probability of never visiting 0. Okay? So in particular, it can go to infinity without ever visiting 0. Okay? So this immediately shows that this difference is vanishing in dimension 1 and 2, and it's not vanishing in higher dimensions. So it does not prove anything about, I mean, the bound is not vanishing, so it does not prove anything about the behavior in higher dimension. This we will do in the next chapter. It will indeed not be vanishing, but we will see this in the next chapter. But in dimension 1 and 2, it does prove that the Gibbs state that you get is rotation invariant. Okay, so this concludes the proof of the Mermin-Wagner theorem, provided I prove this lemma 9.8. Of course, in the statement of the Mermin-Wagner theorem, I gave quantitative bounds on the decay, quantitative bounds on this difference. This you get by doing random walk estimates to get quantitative bounds on this probability. So this is something you can do. It's classical, but it's just random walk estimates. I don't want to discuss that, otherwise we will not have time to do anything else. Okay. So let me explain how you prove this lemma 9,8. So proof of lemma 9,8. So we are after the minimizer of this functional, so I will just write what it means to be a minimizer here. So u will be let's first look at critical points of this functional. So u is a critical point of E, if and only if, well, the gradient has to vanish, so we want that the derivative with respect to S of E of U plus S times delta evaluated at S equals 0 has to be 0. For all delta from ZD to R such that it has to preserve the boundary conditions. So U is fixed to be equal to 0 outside the box lambda and to be equal to 1 inside the box BL. So delta must not change that. So delta has to be 0 for all I which are not in lambda minus BL. Okay? I'm just writing the derivative in direction delta, and I want the derivative in all possible directions to be equal to 0. Okay? I'm looking at the critical point of the functional. Now that's pretty good because this is something that we can compute explicitly. So we are interested in DDS E U plus S delta at S equals 0. So let me recall what this is. So it's 1/2 DDS sum over all ij in E lambda minus BL of gradient of U plus S delta ij square. Now, when I will take the square of this, so I will square this quantity. So this is gradient U plus S gradient delta, and I can take the square. The only term that will survive when I compute derivative with respect to S and take S equal to 0 is the linear term in S. Okay, because the linear term, the S will disappear when I compute the differentiation. I will get a constant which will remain. The constant term just disappears when I when I differentiate, and the quadratic term will give me 0 when I evaluate at 0. Okay, so the only term that remains is the term which is linear in S. So you immediately get that this is equal to the sum over all ij in E lambda minus BL B of gradient U ij gradient delta ij. The 1/2 disappears when you, this mixed term comes with the coefficient 2, so it disappears when you take the 1/2. Okay, so maybe I will let the statement of the lemma on the board and I will continue here. So now this kind of sums should remind you of the kind of sums we got many times in the previous chapter on the GFF. And indeed, we are going to use the same tools, so these discrete green identities, to rewrite this sum. So this is equal, I'm continuing what was written there. So by the discrete DG1, this first discrete green identity, this is equal to minus sum over all I in lambda minus BL of delta I, Laplacian U I, that's the first term. Then you have the boundary term, and maybe I try to put it here, plus the sum over all I in lambda minus BL, all j not in lambda minus BL, that's the boundary term, I and j are neighbors, of delta j gradient U ij. And that's this inequality we proved a few weeks ago. Okay. Very good. So now delta is evaluated outside the box lambda minus BL. So J is outside box lambda minus BL, and by assumption, my delta is 0 everywhere there. So delta is 0. So this whole term is not present. It's just disappears. So if I want U to be a critical point, I need this derivative to be 0 for all delta, which means that I need this sum to be 0 for all deltas. And the only way this can happen is that the Laplacian is 0 for all I. So this implies that U is a critical point of the Dirichlet energy if and only if U, say, Laplacian U I is equal to 0 for all I in lambda minus B. Okay? Plus you have the boundary condition. So Ui is 0 for all I not in lambda, and Ui is 1 for all I in B. So what you get is exactly the massless Dirichlet problem with this particular boundary condition. With this boundary condition here. But we already solved it, right? So that's equivalent to saying that U is the unique solution. So to do this dp0, that is, we already computed it, it's Ui has to be equal to, so it was for the mean, so it's the expected value starting at I of eta, the boundary condition. Okay, eta is bad because we have eta, which means something else. So this boundary condition here, which is 0 outside lambda and 1 inside BL, so it's really the indicator that when the random walk exits the box lambda minus BL, it does so by entering BL and not by exiting lambda. Okay? That's just the boundary condition that you have here. Okay? 0 here, 1 here, so it's exactly this function. So that's what we proved in this in chapter on the GFF. And now this expectation of the indicator is just a probability. That's the probability starting at I, that when it exits lambda minus BL, it exits through BL and not out by exiting lambda. So X enters BL before exiting lambda. Okay, exactly what I want. Okay, that's what we wrote here. So I will denote by U star this unique minimizer. It's not yet clear that it's minimizer. The only thing we know it's a critical point. We still have to check that it's indeed a minimum. It's kind of obvious because the Dirichlet energy is a quadratic form, so it would have difficulties of having maxima. But we'll do it. It's just for free, so we can check that. And then we still have to evaluate the energy at U star, just to check that we get the right quantity. So let me do these two things. First one, let's check that U star is a minimizer of, not just a critical point, but a minimizer of E. And the simplest way of doing that is you look at U star, the energy of U star plus delta, where delta is a profile that does not change the boundary condition on U, as before. And this you write explicitly. So if you look at the definition of this Dirichlet energy, it's immediate that this is equal to the energy of U star plus the energy of delta, because it's a square. When you expand the square, you will get this plus an additional term, which will be, that will be sum over all ij's in E lambda B, gradient U star ij gradient delta ij. That's what you get. It's just an identity. There is nothing there. You just expand the square and you get that. But this expression here that's the expression, it's exactly the expression we had here, and we have proved that this is equal to 0 if I choose u equal u star. And u star was chosen in such a way that this was equal to 0. So this guy, this sum here is equal to 0 by what we had before. If you want, it's again discrete Green identity. The Laplacian of u star is 0, and the boundary condition delta makes the boundary term 0. Okay? But that's what we have done before. So this term is 0. So what you get is E of u star plus E of delta as an identity. That this is equal to that. And now the energy of delta, it's a square. It's a sum of squares, so this is non-negative. So you get that this is always larger than u star. So u star is indeed the minimum, okay, of E. So the only thing that remains to be done is to compute the energy of u star, E of u star. Okay, well, we have a definition, so it's 1/2 sum over all ij in E lambda minus BL d gradient u star ij square, by definition of the Dirichlet energy. Again, you use this discrete Green identity. You get -1/2 sum over all I in lambda minus BL u star I Laplacian u star I, and then plus the boundary term, which will be 1/2 sum over all I in lambda minus BL j not in lambda minus BL I and j neighbors of u star j times gradient u star ij. That's just the same thing as before. Now, u star is chosen as a solution of the Dirichlet problem, so this is 0. So this guy is not there. And we are only left with the boundary term. So let's check what the boundary term is. Yes, I think I can remove that. So let's continue. So we have just this thing. So this is equal to 1/2. Let me write it here in B so that we see it. J not in lambda minus BL I and j neighbors of u star j times u star, it was ij, j minus u star I. Okay. Just rewritten this explicitly. Now let's look at what we know. So this u star I, or u star j, let's start with this guy. This is evaluated outside the box lambda minus BL. So either j is inside BL, in which case u star is equal to 1, or it's outside lambda, in which case u star is equal to 0. So this is equal to 0 if j is not in lambda. It's equal to 1 if j is in BL. This guy. And this guy is the same. Okay? This guy is the same. So what you get from that is 1/2 sum over all I in lambda minus BL, sum over all j, which have to be inside BL, because the other one gives me 0 as a contribution, of 1 times 1 minus u star I. Okay? That's what we get, I and j neighbors. Now, u star I, we have an explicit expression. It's still written here. Okay? So that's 1 minus this probability. 1 minus this probability is the probability of the complementary event. So that's just the probability, starting at I, that x exits lambda before entering BL. Not just this probability which is here. Okay. We are almost done. So now let's just see that we can bring it to something slightly simpler, which is written here. So we still get 1/2. Let me sum first over all j which are in BL. So if I want J to be in BL and to have a neighbor which is not in BL, it has better be in the interior boundary of BL. Okay, so we are already getting something that looks like what we want. Then we have the sum over all I in lambda minus BL, but if it has to be a neighbor of J, it has better be in the exterior boundary of BL, I neighboring J, of this probability. Let me not write it down. It's the same. But now this is equal to the sum over all I neighboring J of the same probability. Why? Because if you take an I which is not in the exterior boundary of L, that is a neighbor of J which is also inside BL, then this event has probability 0. So if you start from inside BL, the probability of exiting lambda before entering BL is 0. Okay? So since this probability is equal to 0 if I is in BL. Okay. So you can do that. But once you do that, you can also add 1 over 2D, and 2D don't do anything. Okay? And now I can use the Markov property for the simple random walk, and this is just Pj of the same event. Okay. And the 1 over 2 2D will give me the D, which is here, and this gives me the probability that is written. Okay, this concludes the proof of this lemma 9.8 and therefore of the Mermin-Wagner theorem. Okay. So this Mermin-Wagner theorem tells you that you cannot, among the things that it tells you is that the fact that you cannot have spontaneous magnetization dimension 1 and 2. It also tells you, as maybe you have done it in exercises, that the 2-point function, the expected value of, say, S0 times Sk, the spin at 0 and spin at k, if you take their scalar product, and you let k go to infinity, this has to vanish. So let me write down the number of the section. We are now moving to 9.4, which is decay of correlation. 9.4, decay of correlations. Okay. So among the things that the Mermin-Wagner theorem implies is the fact that if you take the limit as k goes to infinity, so norm of k goes to infinity, of S0 times Sk, under any infinite volume Gibbs state, this is equal to 0 when d equal 1 and 2. It's a consequence. Maybe you have done it, maybe you will do it. I don't know. Okay. So it follows. However, the bounds, the quantitative bounds it gives you on this decay, so this decays, because it's going to 0, it has to decay, but the bounds it gives is very poor. So what you get, in fact, is that S0 Sk is actually smaller than some constant over square root of k in dimension 1, and some constant over square root of log k in dimension 2, which is actually very bad. The real behavior is much better than that. I will discuss the real behavior, make some comment at the end of the chapter, but it's much better than that. So our goal in this section is to see whether in dimension 2 at least we can improve on this very, very slow decay of this correlation. Okay? We want to improve on that. And the interesting case is dimension 2. In dimension 1, it's very easy actually to prove that this decays exponentially fast at all possible temperatures. The system in dimension 1 with finite range interaction, it will always have exponential decay, at least for bounded spins like this one. Okay, so we want an improvement in dimension 2. And for simplicity, I will only work with the XY model. So I remind you, the XY model is the one which has a Hamiltonian, which is of the form. Let me write it like that: beta Si scalar product Sj. Okay. With a minus. Okay. And that's, as usual, Ij in E lambda b. Okay. So I will only work with this guy, and as usual, I can, since these are two-dimensional spins, I can parameterize them by the angle. So this is also minus beta, sum over all Ij, as before, cosine of theta j minus theta I. Okay. So we work with this quantity here, with this model. Okay. And I want to prove something much better than this 1 over root log decay. So we make a break, and then I will explain how you do that. Okay, I think we'll start. So I want to start by giving you a heuristic argument to see what we should expect for this type of for the decay of this type of correlation functions, say in the XY model, two-dimensional XY model. Okay. At least at very low temperature. This will be useful because it will tell us what we should be looking for, and moreover, you will see that some parts of the proof that we are going to give, which might seem very strange, you will see that there is some manipulation that we are doing that is much more strange than what we have done in the previous theorem, can be understood as generalization of some things that we will do in this heuristic argument. So heuristic argument. So this will be completely non-rigorous. My point is not to make something precise, just to give you some ideas. So let's start with the Hamiltonian of our XY model. So it's cos. So sum of all Ij as usual of cosine of theta j minus theta I. Now I will be assuming that the temperature is very, very low. So beta is very large. Beta is very large. So when beta is very large, since you want to minimize the energy, locally you want the cosine to be as large as possible. So you want to have theta j equal to theta I, more or less. So theta j and theta I will be very close to each other. So I'm assuming, okay, so assume beta very large. Then that means, okay, I will do it here. So that means that theta j minus theta I will be very close to 0 for all Ij. I'm not doing anything rigorous, so I don't have to be too precise about my statement, but certainly that's what we would expect. At very low temperature, the angle between two neighbors should be very close to each other. So that means that this cosine, I should be able to expand it. So this should be very close to minus beta sum over Ij of the cosine, not the cosine, so 1 minus 1/2 theta j minus theta I square. I've just expanded the cosine, and since it's not rigorous, I don't care about error terms and things like that. So we should expect something of this type. But if you do that, you see that this tells you that the Hamiltonian of the XY model, let me put XY to stress the fact that I'm discussing this model, say in lambda, at inverse temperature beta, should be very close when beta is very large, should be close to the Hamiltonian. The term that you have here, this guy which is here, sum over neighbors of the different square, it's exactly the type of terms we have in the Hamiltonian of the Gaussian free field. So it should be very similar to the Hamiltonian of the Gaussian free field in lambda at a temperature which is 4 beta. Why 4 beta? If you remember in the Gaussian free field, in front of the sum of the phi I minus phi j square, I had a 1 over 4d. Okay, if you remember. So dimension is 2 here, it was 1 over 8. Okay, and I only have 1 over 2. Okay, there is actually beta also. So I had a beta over 8, and now I have only a beta over 2. So I have to compensate, and I have to. This gives me beta, 4 beta. Doesn't matter. I mean, it will just give me something quantitatively more precise, but it's not important. Okay, so you get something like that. So this argument suggests that the behavior of the XY model at very low temperature should be very close to the behavior of the GFF at another very low temperature, where beta is 4, multiplied by 4. Okay? So in particular, if now I'm looking at S0 scalar product SK, this correlation function in the XY model at beta, this, okay, lambda beta, let's be precise. This should be, okay, this I can certainly write as the cosine of theta k minus theta 0 lambda beta. So in xy, so I have to, since I'm in finite volume, I have to say what is the boundary condition. So let's take everybody pointing upward, which means that I have theta equals 0 as boundary condition. Okay, all the angles outside the box are fixed to 0. Okay. Now, by this discussion that we had before, I would expect this to be very close. Okay, let me do it in 2 steps. Maybe it will be easier. So this I can certainly also write as e to the I theta k minus theta naught xy theta equals 0 lambda beta. So the only thing I've done is, so what is this? This is cosine of theta k minus theta naught, which is what I have here, plus I times sine of theta k minus theta naught, but with this boundary condition, by symmetry, the sine part is just 0. The expected value of the sine will give you 0 because you can always take one angle and the opposite angle and they will cancel. So this is just an identity. And this should be very close to the expectation of I phi k minus phi naught in the GFF with 0 boundary condition in the box lambda at inverse temperature 4 beta. Okay, that's the guess that comes from the fact that I expect the angle between neighbors to be very close to each other. So we expect something like that. So this is nice because this I can compute. Okay, so let me compute it. So the phi k minus phi 0, it's easy to check that it's a Gaussian random variable. It's of mean 0 because the mean of the field is 0. And it has some variance. Let me call it sigma square k. Depends on k. Okay. And actually you can compute it. So sigma square k is equal to the variance in lambda of phi k minus phi 0, which is the variance in lambda of phi k plus the variance in lambda of phi 0 plus minus twice the covariance in lambda of phi 0 and phi k. Just variance of a sum. Okay. And then these variances, we have computed them for the GFF. We know what they are equal to. So we got rid of the beta immediately in the GFF. We set beta to 1. So if we didn't set beta to 1, we would have here 1 over 4 beta that comes. And then we will get what we proved. So this will give you g lambda kk. So the green function in the box lambda evaluated at kk plus g lambda 0, 0 minus 2 g lambda 0 k. And that's what we computed in the previous chapter. Now, again, random walk estimates allow you to compute what is the limit of this thing as lambda goes to ZD. Where in dimension 2, if you remember, the variance of the field diverges. It goes to infinity. So each of these 3 terms is going to infinity as lambda goes to Z2. Each term is going to infinity, but this particular combination of the terms is not going to infinity. The divergence just cancel, and what you get is that this you can prove that it goes, when lambda goes to Z2, it converges to, I think it's 4 over pi log of the Euclidean norm of k. Okay. Some computation using random walks, classical things, discrete potential theory if you want. So this you can compute, and you get this kind of results. So we get in the end 1 over pi beta log of k, okay, for the variance. Okay. Now, that's not what I'm really interested in. What I'm interested in is the expected value for this GFF of ei phi k minus phi 0, so let's compute it. So let me just make a brief parenthesis. That's something most of you probably have already seen, but I still want to do and you can do it in different ways. I want to do it this particular way and I want to redo it now because the way I'm going to compute this expectation is very, very similar to what we are going to do in this argument for the XY model later, the rigorous version of the argument. So let's take Z, a normal random variable with mean 0 and variance sigma square. Okay? And we want to compute the expected value of EIZ, which is exactly what we want to compute here for this particular random variable. Okay? So this, by definition, it's 1 over square root of 2 pi sigma square integral over R of EI. So my I, when I write it like that, it's really the square root of minus 1. I'm trying to write the other i's like that, so okay. I'll try to avoid them if possible. So EIX minus x squared over 2 sigma square dx. Okay, that's just by definition of the Gaussian and 0 sigma square. And now the usual one typical way of computing this integral is by completing the square. So here you just rewrite that as e minus 1 over 2 sigma square x minus I sigma square square. And then there is a remainder that you have to compensate, so it's e minus sigma square over 2. Okay. Just complete the square in the exponent and you will get that. Okay. So if I do that, what I get is so e minus sigma square over 2 over square root of 2 pi sigma square. Very good. And then the integral over R of e minus 1 over 2 sigma square x minus I sigma square dx. Okay. And now one way of computing this, I'm not very happy with this I sigma square. I would like to get rid of it. If it was a real integral, we would just make a change of variable and be done with it, right? To run the complex plane, we have to argue. So let's argue. So this is the real line. That's the real line shifted by I sigma square. Let's say 0 is here in the real line. And now I'm integrating over the whole real line, but let me only integrate between minus capital M and capital N. This will be a very large number. Okay, I'm integrating over this path here. And then I close it like that. Okay, integrating over this path in the complex plane. Okay. The integrand is obviously analytic. So by Cauchy theorem, the integral over this loop is 0. Okay. Moreover, the contribution that comes from the two vertical pieces, it vanishes when m is going to infinity. Believe me or check it. So the contribution from these two things vanish as m goes to infinity, which is what we are interested in. Okay. So what we conclude is that the integral over the real axis is the same as the integral over the real axis shifted by I sigma square. So if I do that, so I get that this is equal to e minus sigma square over 2 square root of 2 pi sigma square integral over r plus I sigma square e minus 1 over 2 sigma square. Let me call it small z to say that I'm in complex plane now, minus I sigma square dz. Okay, now we are integrating on this particular path, which is just a real line shifted by I sigma square on the complex plane. So if you want to compute this integral along this path, you have to parameterize the path, which gives you a real integral now, again, sigma square over 2, square root of 2 pi sigma square, integral over r, e minus x square over 2 sigma square, or let's say t square over 2 sigma square, dt, just by parameterizing this path. But now this integral, we know what it is. It's equal to square root of 2 pi sigma square. So this integral cancels with the denominator here. And what you're left with is e minus sigma square over 2. Okay. So that's one way of computing this kind of Fourier transform of the Gaussian. And if you do that, so we are interested in this quantity. So I can apply exactly this formula that we derived, and what plays the role of the sigma square there in the formula is exactly this sigma square k that we have derived here. So what do we get in the end from this heuristic argument? We get the following. Okay, so you get from all these things that S0 Sk computed in XY model with boundary condition pointing upward in lambda, beta, should be very close to, we may follow all this computation and we get E minus 1/2 times sigma k square, which is 1 over pi beta, so it will be 2 pi beta that I get here, times the log of k, Euclidean norm of k. But then this is just Euclidean norm of k to the power minus 1 over 2 pi beta. That should hold when beta is very large. Because that's what we assume in the computation. Okay? So our guess, our conjecture, is that the decay of this product, as k goes to infinity, should be of this type. So it should decay as a power law, not as 1 over root log k, but as 1 over k to some power, which depends on beta. Okay. So I will say that at the end of the chapter. It turns out that it's true. Okay. Nobody has proved that as a lower bound you don't know how to prove that the constant is 2 pi. Okay. Get something else. But as an upper bound, what we are going to prove now is as an upper bound you can prove that the constant is 2 pi, essentially. So let me do that. So let me state the main result we are going to prove, which is theorem 912. So let's consider any infinite volume Gibbs state, B, an infinite volume Gibbs state, any one Gibbs state for the 2D XY model. Okay. At inverse temperature beta. Okay. Then, for any epsilon positive, you can actually do a bit better than what I'm stating, but I want to minimize computations. For any epsilon positive, you can find some beta 0 of epsilon, such that for any beta larger than this beta 0 of epsilon, for any ij, or say any k in Z2, we have that the expected value of S0 Sk beta, this decays like a constant times k minus 1 minus epsilon over 2 pi beta. Okay, so up to the epsilon, it's exactly, and you can get rid of it, and you can improve a bit this, but you get exactly this as an upper bound. Okay, so we are going to prove that, and the idea is very nice. So it's very similar in spirit. It looks very similar to what we did for the Memming-Wagner theorem. It's also an idea of making some inhomogeneous rotations and optimizing over this inhomogeneous rotation at some point, except that the rotation, instead of being by a real angle, is by an imaginary angle. So it's immediately a bit more strange. But notice that's exactly what we did here. So when we wanted to compute this quantity, what we did, what we can interpret what we did as taking our Gaussian random variable and just adding to it some imaginary part. That's what we did. We added I sigma square to our random variable. And so we are shifting it in the complex plane. We are going to do exactly the same thing. We are going to rotate in the complex plane our spins. You will see that in a moment. So let me start the proof. Okay, so this we did, so proof. Okay, so as before, in order to lighten the notation, let me write lambda for a box, square box of radius n. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to prove, since I want this to work for any infinite von Gibbs state, I will prove a bound like that for any big box lambda with arbitrary boundary condition. And the bound will be uniform in the boundary condition so that I will be able to take a limit and get any Gibbs state I want. Okay, so will upper bound the following quantity. It will be the expected value of S0 scalar product Sk in lambda, so this box Bn, with some arbitrary boundary condition, inverse temperature beta. Beta will not write it down later, just write it here, uniformly in eta and in n, provided that n such that the box Bn contains the vertex k, otherwise, okay, does not make any sense. Okay, that's what we are going to do. So of course this will imply our statement. Okay, provided the bound I get is of the proper form, but okay, that's what we'll get. Okay, so let's start. Let's start with this. So we have expected value of S0 Sk, lambda, eta. As I said, I omit now the beta, it's fixed in the proof. Then this, as usual, this is just the cosine of theta k minus theta 0 lambda, and I still write eta, right? It's the theta. I could instead just state what are the angle outside. I let the same notation, doesn't matter. And this, now I want to do the first step that we did, what I just erased. Okay. So we were saying that by symmetry I can write this as ei theta k minus theta 0. Here there is no symmetry that I can use because the boundary condition is whatever. But certainly this is always true as an inequality. So ei theta k minus theta 0, expected value, lambda, eta. Just because between this complex number and this complex number, the only difference, well, they both have the same real part, and this one I've added some imaginary part. So I'm only making the modulus bigger. Okay, they have the same real part. So this is an inequality. Okay. So what I want to understand now is this expectation here. Okay. But directly in the XY model, not going through the GFF as we did in the heuristic argument. So let's look at expected value of ei theta k minus theta 0. Right. So this, by definition, it's 1 over the partition function. Integral, so the integral is a bit ugly, so let me introduce a notation, because I have to integrate over all spins. So let me write integral d theta bn. This will mean integral from minus pi pi, integral from minus pi pi, product over all I in lambda. Oh, let me put d theta lambda, I said I used lambda, of d theta I. Okay. Instead of writing all this every time, I just want to write integral of d theta lambda, it means the same thing. Okay, just a notation for that. So d theta lambda, and then we get what? So we get this, so ei theta k minus theta 0. And then we get the Hamiltonian, which is or minus the Hamiltonian, which will give you plus beta sum over all ij in E lambda b cosine of theta j minus theta I. Okay? That's just by definition of what this expectation means. Okay. And I'm using the proper boundary condition. So when you evaluate theta j outside the box, you take the angle corresponding to the boundary condition eta. Yeah. Okay, so that's what we have. Now what we are interested in is the modulus of this quantity. So we want the modulus of this integral. That in general is a very complicated thing to do. So it's a complex integral. The naive thing, which is to say that the modulus of the integral is smaller than the integral of the modulus, will not lead you anywhere, because the modulus of this part will give you 1, so we will lose the dependence on k immediately from the start. Right? So that's not a good idea. So you have to do something. And the nice idea, so it's due to McBrien and Spencer, the nice idea is to try to replicate what we did in the Gaussian case. That is, we are going to shift each of these variable theta j inside the box. We are going to shift it by some imaginary amount rj. So we rotate each theta, say theta I in lambda by, or let's say, I could say I in ZD, but it will be 0 outside lambda, by, okay, I is bad, so theta j, by I times Rj, with R, a function from ZD to R, such that Ri is equal, okay, Rj is equal to 0 for all j not in lambda. Okay, so I'm making a rotation by an imaginary angle. Okay, but you will see that it will be immediately clear that it's a good idea. Just a second. And so that's really what I want to do. So that's for, say, theta j. So here was the real line. And now I'm looking at the real line plus I Rj. And then I was integrating from minus pi to pi. And now I want just to observe that if you integrate from minus pi to pi, and then you go up, then you go here, and then you go down, looking at this integral, then again, by the analyticity of the integrand, this is analytic. And the fact that it's a loop, the integral will, the integral over the loop will be 0. Okay? But now, by periodicity, the contribution that you get from this exactly cancel the contribution you get from that. Just by periodicity of the angles. Okay? So this cancels exactly, there is no limit, nothing to do, just cancels. And you are left with you just conclude that the integral of this is equal to the integral of that. Okay? So the integral is unchanged if I make such shift. So the conclusion is that the value of the integral is left unchanged. Okay. Now I claim that after you've made such a shift, now you can take the modulus inside. And let's see why. Okay. So if you bring the modulus inside after having made the shift, what do you get? You get one term which will be EI. So this theta k minus theta 0 will become theta k minus theta 0 plus I rk minus I r0. Okay? Modulus. So the modulus of this part is 1. That's what we said before, and that was what was very bad. We were not very happy, but it was 1. Okay? But now I get, since I have an imaginary part here, I will get some I square, so this will be E minus Rk minus R0. Okay? Which is very good. I get some decay in the distance. It does not vanish anymore after this shift. So that's the first observation. The second observation is what happens with the modulus of this guy, exponential of beta, sum of the cosine. Okay? So we have modulus of E beta, let's say cosine theta j minus theta I. what happened to this guy? Oh, plus the IR. So plus IRJ minus IR. I should not have used I, but okay. So this you compute again explicitly. This gives you E beta cosh of Rj minus Ri. Okay. Just times cos of theta j minus theta I. Just a simple identity. Okay. Okay. So now I'm going to inject these two identities inside this expression. So if I do that, I get the following. So what I wanted to compute, which was the expected value of S0 times Sk in lambda eta, this is smaller because I've taken the modulus inside, smaller than 1 over the partition function, this integral d theta lambda, okay? And then I get this term. So this term is not depending on theta, so I can take it out. So let me put it here. So it's E minus Rk minus R0. This is good. Then I still have E to the beta, there is a sum, okay, beta, sum over all ij's as before. Let me not write the details. Ij's of cosh Rj minus Ri cos theta j minus theta I. Okay? That's what you get. So it's already nice because, I mean, everything is real now, which is already better. And we have extracted some dependence in K. Maybe with playing with R, choosing properly R, I will be able to do something with that. Now you need a second idea. And the second idea is very simple, actually. Let me write it here. So the idea is the following. So this is equal to E minus Rk minus R naught over the partition function, integral d theta lambda. And this I will slightly change it. So it's E beta, sum over all edges ij as usual, cosh Rj minus Ri, as before. And now I'm going to subtract 1 here, and then cosine of theta j minus theta I. If I do that, of course, not an identity, so I have to correct. So this is multiplied by E beta sum over all ij's cosine theta j minus theta I. Okay, now it's an identity. But what I've added here, this is just the Boltzmann factor. So this is equal to E minus h lambda of the configuration theta. Okay. So I can interpret this whole integral divided by the partition function as the expected value of this function under the Gibbs measure. Which is nice because it's a probability measure, so it's normalized. So this I've not touched. Okay. Let me write it down. So what you get from this trick is that this is equal to E minus Rk minus R0, and then the expected value of this guy, E beta sum over all ij's in the edges intersecting the box lambda, cosh of Rj minus Ri minus 1 cos theta j minus theta I lambda eta. Okay? We just reinterpreted the integral divided by partition function as the expected value of this particular function. But now this cosine, this cosh minus 1, this is always greater or equal to 0, because cosh is always greater or equal to 1. Okay? So that's greater or equal to 0. The cosine is certainly always smaller than 1. So the whole thing here inside the expectation, this whole thing is smaller than E beta sum over all ij's cosh Rj minus Ri. this does not depend on theta anymore. I can take it out of the expectation. The only thing that remains is the expectation of 1, which is 1. Okay, so we just get that this is smaller than E minus Rk minus R0 plus beta sum over all ij's in E lambda b cosh, there is a minus 1 that I forgot, cosh of Rj minus Ri minus 1. Okay? So we are done. I mean, there are no more, now you don't need any ideas anymore. It's done. Now what you have to do, you want to minimize this because I want to get as good a bound as possible on this expectation. So I want this to be as small as possible. So I have to optimize over R, which you can do similarly as to what we did before. Problem is that optimizing with a cosh, it's a nightmare. So it's not a very nice function if you want to find the optimum. So what we are going to do is we are going to use the fact that we are interested in what happens when beta is very large. And when beta is very large, I claim that I will be able to approximate cosh minus 1 by something which is quadratic in Rj minus Ri. So let me just say a few words about that. So the Rk this function R that we are going to choose, we'll choose it in such a way that we have the following. We'll choose R such that the following property is true. So let me write it down correctly. So I will call it S. I don't remember why I called it S. But Rj minus, doesn't matter, Ri minus Rj smaller than C over beta for any ij nearest neighbor in the box. I mean, edge intersecting the box. So we are going to choose the function R such that it changes not very much when you go from one point to its neighbors. Not very much in the sense that there is a universal constant, C, so for some C. Fixed, okay, divided by beta. So if I take beta large, this is very small for all neighbors ij. This is the choice we are going to make. It will satisfy this. Okay? So assume that I have such an R. Then I can simplify my cosh as follows. So I want to use the same notations as here. So let's do it. So let's fix some epsilon positive. Remember that there was some epsilon in the statement. Fix some epsilon. Then if beta is sufficiently large, say larger than some beta 0 of epsilon, sufficiently large, we get that the cosh of here Rj minus Ri minus 1, this will be smaller than 1/2. I put 1 plus epsilon just to take into account the error terms, Rj minus Ri squared. And this is true for any ij in E lambda b. Okay? The only thing I'm using is that if I choose beta sufficiently large, this difference Rj minus Ri is as small as I wish, and then I can Taylor expand the cosine. The first term is 1, but I'm subtracting 1, so it disappears. And then the next term in the cosine, it's an even function, so the next order is the second order. You get this, and I'm just paying with an 1 plus epsilon to incorporate all the remainder, the error terms. Okay? So we get a bound of this form, which I can now inject here. And I get my final bound on this expectation, this correlation function, which now is very nice. It can be easily studied. So you get that S0 Sk lambda eta, this is smaller than E minus Rk minus R0 plus, and let me see how I wrote it. Okay. Okay, I write it like that. It's not a bad idea. So 1 plus epsilon E of R. And there is the beta that there is a beta, right, somewhere that I'm forgetting. The beta which is here. Let me not forget it. Let me put beta. Beta here. Do I need the 1/2? No, there's just 1 plus epsilon. Beta 1 plus epsilon. Yeah. Okay, so I've not done anything, right? I've just injected this here, okay, and recognized the Dirichlet function. So the sum of, so again, ER is exactly as before. So ER is 1/2 sum over all ij in lambda, in epsilon lambda b, gradient R ij square. It's the Dirichlet energy, exactly what we used before. Now it's of R. Okay, it's the same thing as we used before. Okay, and this beta times 1 plus epsilon, I will call it beta prime, just not to write 1 plus epsilon too many times. Okay. So what we get is that this two-point function, this is smaller than some E minus d of R, where this functional d of R is just Rk minus R naught minus beta prime E of R. Okay. So what remains to do is to minimize this exponential, that is to maximize d. We want to maximize this functional d over all function R from ZD to R such that Ri is 0 outside lambda. Okay, that's what we want to do. And if we are lucky, this condition that we have used will be satisfied by the solution, which will be the case. Okay, so that's what we want to do. So let me state the corresponding result again, the lemma, which tells you what is the maximizer of this functional d. So now the end of the proof is very similar to what we did for Mermin-Wagner theorem. So it's lemma 913. Okay, this we don't care. So D possesses a unique maximizer among functions, as I said, so among functions R from ZD to R such that Ri equal to 0 outside the box lambda. It is the unique function such that the Laplacian of R at I, so it will not be harmonic as before, or not everywhere at least. What you get is that it's harmonic everywhere inside the box except at the 2 points 0 and k that appear here. It's not harmonic at 0 and k. It's given by the indicator at 0, I is equal to 0, minus the indicator I is equal to k over beta prime. Okay. So this is equal to 0 in the box outside the point 0 and k, so it's harmonic everywhere except at these 2 points. It's equal to 1 at 0 and minus 1 over beta prime and minus 1 over beta prime at these 2 points. So that's for I in the box lambda. And finally, you can write it explicitly. Ri star is equal to the green function in the box lambda, evaluated at ik, ik, minus the green function lambda I0, divided by 4 beta prime. Again, for any I in lambda. So that's the statement. So time is essentially up, so I will not finish now. So I will assume this statement next week. I will start by assuming this statement. I will show that if you use that and you inject it in this estimate here, this gives you the decay I claimed in the theorem. Okay. We'll see this next week. It will take, I don't know, 5-10 minutes. And then I will prove this lemma, which will take 20 minutes, something like that. And then we will move on to the last chapter, which is on reflection positivity. And on this chapter on reflection positivity, I will prove that if you take the same model, say the XY model, or more general ON models, in dimension 3 and higher, at sufficiently low temperature, there is spontaneous magnetization in long-range order. Okay? So these are things that I will discuss starting from next week. Okay. Questions? Yes?
Is it necessary? We said that we were going to choose beta large enough, so
yes,
something like this. But is it possible not to choose beta large enough and just to try to really work with the hyperbolic cosine?
In principle, I don't see any reason why you cannot do that. Yeah. But in any case, this bound, so it's an upper bound. Okay? It will be true for all beta, this upper bound. But for small values of beta, it's very bad. At high temperature, the decay of the two-point function, the decay of S0 Sk, is actually exponentially fast in K. Okay. So you don't really care about extending this upper bound to all betas since it's not relevant for small betas. Right? Yes?
You don't need to maximize a function which satisfies S?
Well, I could, but it's easier just to maximize over this function without any constraint and to check that the solution satisfies S. Okay, it's the same, but it's easier to do it this way. Other questions? No? So see you next week.